Now we're going to get to India. And as I noted in our last class when we talked about the revolutions, um, one of the main reasons that the British abandoned the war effort against the American colonists was that they were being challenged by the French in India. That's how important India had become to the British by 1781. So, what we're going to look at today is how it gets to that level, and then the importance of India moving forward into the 19th century. So, the British had been in East India since 1600s because of the British East India Company. The British East India Company had been trading in India since 1603 and had really made a lot of inroads with the Mughal Empire at that time. Now, as the Mughal Empire began to erode and as um, lesser leaders began to take charge of the Mughal Empire, the British East India Company began to take advantage of that erosion of power. They began to buy up land and buy up land deeds from the Mughals in exchange for weaponry, in exchange for munitions, in exchange for assistance in subduing rebellions and in exchange for conquering their enemies. So the Mughal Empire just basically began to sell off parts of their own empire in order to keep themselves afloat. And so the India East India Company pretty much began to control most of the English subcontinent as they began to take all the lands with the fall of the Mughal Empire. By the time Mughal power had completely eroded, the East India Company had gained a huge chunk of the Indian subcontinent, and pretty soon into the 18th century, the British East India Company was making lots of money from this land, gathering the natural resources and sending money back to the British Empire. Well, by the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire is completely different than it was in the early 1600s, and they began to look and see the charter of the British East India Company, and they pretty much just got rid of it. And all the holdings of the British East India Company came under the holdings of the British Crown, and so by 1858, the British government just took the land away from the East India Company, paid them off basically pennies on the dollar, and began to take direct control of the Indian subcontinent. And by the time the British government fully took control of this of the land, 60% of India was under direct control, and this, that area here in red. Meanwhile, the rest of it was under what's known as a sphere of influence. And a sphere of influence is what we'll go deeper into that in class. But basically, what it is that um, all the areas around you um, are under direct control, and so they all uh, give off some sort of influence towards you. So you are surrounded by other areas that are influencing you. So you just this this circle of influence, and this influence, you could see here how these lands were pretty much autonomous, independent, but they're surrounded by areas under direct control by the British. So, of course, if they want to trade with other lands, or if they want to do any sort of trading into the coast, they have to go through directly controlled lands by the British, and so you have no choice but to be under basic British control at this time. Um, So one of the good things that actually happens here in India is that the British start to industrialize. You start seeing factories being built in order to go ahead and begin the refining process of all the natural resources that they're getting from India. And you also begin to see the building of railroads and canals in order to move goods from place to place in India, and with the building of railroads and with the building of canals, also comes more transportation and much more movement by the Indian people. So you start seeing much more of a movement by the Indian people. So there's a lot more cross cultural movement and a lot more solidarity growing by the Indian people. Now, one of the things that I always ask in this classroom is, does colonialism have a purpose? Does the act of colonizing a different people serve some sort of positive effect? And a lot of times when I ask this question, I really look at India as a prime example of this, because it the British did bring in a sense of improvement to the area because of the many decades of Mughal misrule. India had been left in pretty much in disrepair, and so what the British actually bring in is a relatively honest and efficient government, where you had some local leaders retaining power and being left in place. Um, as the British came in, they gave a lot of attention to education, a lot of attention to fundamentally restoring the hierarchical system that had existed in India from the Vedic period, and had slowly been eroded, and then during the Mughal rule had completely been torn apart. So they came in and helped the higher bred castes restore the system, and the higher castes definitely benefited greatly, as they were able to make a lot of money and actually send their kids off to British schools, both within India and in England itself. So this British influence begins to show completely throughout the subcontinent, as they begin as only the British really could unite India as one. India has traditionally been a collection of groups and cultures, a vast array of different regional differences. Is basically all you have in India. Even the southern part of India is not. It has never really been conquered by uh, any imperial force in India before, and so when the British come in, they begin to unite India. And as I said earlier, they set up railroads, they build canals to move ships through, and so Indian people are moving throughout the subcontinent like they never have before. And so this basically gives a much greater pan-Indian identity, as opposed to a very regional Indian identity. So India is united as one, and they begin to see themselves more as citizens of British of the British government than actually Indian, and until they start seeing a lot of these racial and cultural issues that is going to play a much more important part later on down the line. However, as the British are beginning to unite people, they're also using the differences to subdue their other groups. As they begin to move much more into direct rule of other places, they will use these regional and cultural differences, these tribal differences, in some instances, to subdue other groups and bring them under the direct um, British rule. So even though they are uniting India into a much more collective identity, they are also using differences in order to uh, uh, weaken resistance to British rule. And one of the last things that I'll talk about before we move on is this positivity in colonial reform, is that there is a lot of reform of practices that even a lot of the mainstream Hindus were trying to get rid of. We'll talk more about these guys later on in class, but the Thuggees were a huge problem, especially after the fall um, of the Mughal Empire, as they were bandits and thieves and basically murderers that would prey upon merchants and traders throughout the Indian subcontinent. So much so that the British had to come in and were basically used as guards for caravans for merchants as they were building the roads back up. But it took the British Empire to come in and eradicate the Thuggee problem. And then they also reformed a lot of the Hindu practices that were less than seemly, such as the act of sati, which is where a male Hindu would would be buried and burnt. His body would be burnt, and all his possessions would go with him. And one of those possessions would be his wife, who would be forced to throw herself onto the funeral pyre to make sure to be with her husband in the next life. So practices like this, practices like what's it virtue killings, things like that were almost completely eradicated from India during the British rule. They still exist, and sometimes they exist up to this day, but they're in very remote, very rural areas where there's not a lot of oversight by the government, where there where it sort of continues on uh, in clandestine ways. So but at this point in India, it was a much more accepted practice that slowly gets pushed away because of the British coming in and putting their foot down. And this is where we talk about the other side of the coin. Even though there are some positives for colonialism, for British colonialism in India in specific, there is a huge cost of colonialism. The main cost that you see in India is that British textiles are going to greatly damage the local textile industry. You had the beginnings of a homegrown textile industry in India. However, the British were much more focused on taking the raw materials from India, shipping them to England, and then sending them back as textile goods in India. So it's a manufactured goods in India, and so because of the ability to mass produce things, they were much cheaper and much more affordable for the average Indian. And so, even though the homemade textiles in India were much better quality, they were also much more expensive because of the man hours, because of the money, that labor and money that went into making these things, while the British were creating a very mass manufactured, very cheap industry that basically, if you were a poor Indian, you could afford maybe one shirt made by hand, or these large factory mass produced shirts you probably buy a dozen. So it it completely undercut the local textile industry and made the Indians much more dependent on the work of the British Empire. You also had the British and the Indian gentry taking advantage of the zamindars. And the Zamindar system has its origins in the Mughal Empire, as the Zamindars were local chieftains that were raised up to nobility that would be given large tracts of land, and these large tracts of land would have peasants on there, and the Zamindars would collect taxes from the lands and pay parts of that um, to the Mughal Empire. And so what the British came in is they took advantage of this system by creating their own zamindars, and the English East India Company was really good at um, taking advantage of this, as they would raise petty tribal chieftains up to this princely state, and they would uh, basically give anybody that could collect enough peasants money, land, and noble titles. So they began to use the Zamindars basically as their muscle, or as their sort of tax collectors throughout the region. The British came in and they just used the system as well, and so this is why they're able to use indirect rules, because they already had a system in place where you had people that would gladly take advantage of the peasants, take their money, and give it to the British government, as long as they kept their noble titles, or were given noble titles, and as long as they stayed sort of in charge. It was better to be number two in the system than all the way down at the bottom. You did have a bit of limited industrialization taking place in India. As I said, there was a local textile industry, but there are also small factories and um, some and the beginnings of agricultural industrialization. However, they really didn't have the capital to move industrialization further away from the agricultural beginnings and move it into the large industrial factories that the British were able to. And a lot of this is because of the advantage given to British imports. As I said, this undercut the local industry and also made it so that they couldn't industrialize as much as they wanted to. But most importantly, foreign rule does have a psychological effect to the British people, and this is true for all of this type of colonialism, of all this type of imperialism, is that being ruled by outsiders in your own country has a psychological effect. It makes you feel lesser. It makes you feel like you are subordinate. You are not as worthy as these foreigners, and that's what happens here in the British Raj. You have the very white uh, English people coming in and basically living like princes and being catered to um, by Indian people in their own land. So they basically became second class citizens in their own country to people that were never born or had no real connection to the land. And this does indeed have a psychological effect. And this psychological effect is going to be what manifests itself as the desire for freedom. And if you look at the way that colonialists, especially British colonialists, treat the people that they're conquering from Africa to the Middle East to India and even beyond, there is definitely this racial component to this that we've looked at through the prism of white man's burden, the prism of this this false notion of social Darwinism, that there is something about the the culture of Britishness, or the Western culture, that is superior to that of brown skinned peoples, and they are the British are clearly um, uh, playing this out in real life during the British Raj, and the Indian people have no choice but to figure out how to fight back eventually. But that is a story for another day. Instead, we're going to look at the way that colonialism plays out in Southeast Asia before next time we move into China, and the way that European encroachment plays into Chinese history. So you have by 1900, this is going to be um, the world as we know it. By 1900, all of Southeast Asia will be under control by a European force, and this begins with the French moving into Southeast Asia, taking over the area of Laos, Cambodia, and what's known as Cochin China, which will become Vietnam. Um, and so Cochin China, Laos, and Cambodia become French um, possessions in 1840. Um, and then this becomes known as French Indochina. And just like in Africa, the French come in and begin to try and assimilate the people of Southeast Asia into their own culture. And so they begin to push French. They begin to push this notion of Frenchness onto the people of Southeast Asia without really giving them the benefits of being French citizens. And so, because of this sort of forced assimilation, you're going to see a lot of rebellions take place, a lot of struggles against the French in French Indochina, and in some ways, this will be much more important later on. Don't want to give spoiler alerts, but just be prepared for us to come back to French Indochina later on. Um, the Russians are also going to move into Northern Asia. They're going to move into Siberia and Central Asia as they begin to also move um, uh, into the Persian empire and move into Afghanistan and Nepal. So you're going to see the Russians, as they are, as much as they're being denied entrance into the Balkans, to the Black Sea region, and into Eastern Europe. Uh, they're going to start to also move eastward into Siberia and down towards Afghanistan and Nepal. So um, as they move into Afghanistan and Nepal, however, they're not able to conquer these people. Instead, they have the sphere of influence issue, because no one can really conquer Afghanistan. No one ever really does conquer Afghanistan. And as you have the Russians and the French moving in, and then the Dutch and the Portuguese are also in Southeast Asia. You see the British beginning to use buffer zones to protect India, places like Singapore and Burma. You have the um, British using these areas to protect India away from any sort of encroachment by the French or the Russians, or anybody. Really, India becomes the crown jewel of the British colonial empire, and they do anything that they can to keep others away. And so the nature of colonial rule then becomes this: it is slow to create democratic oppositions and slow to adopt educational reforms. The nature of colonial rule in Southeast Asia keeps Southeast Asia poor, keeps Southeast Asia from developing as quickly as other nations can. And one of the things about Southeast Asia is that it has been so important to world history. It was the reason why exploration happened. However, by this point, by the 19th century, when um, the Europeans are completely controlling it, they are basically making Southeast Asia no longer important. They are making sure that Southeast Asia does not develop and does not continue to thrive as it probably would have without European intervention. And Britain will be the one to make the biggest push for colonialism in the end. They will, basically from the Caribbean all the way through Africa, and into Southeast Asia, and then finally into Australia and New Zealand. You will have the British Empire setting up colonies and putting people in these areas or taking complete control. And Australia and New Zealand will have some parallels to North America. This is where they will send people the British government will send people that they don't like, while at the same time they will remove people that are already there. In in both instances of Australia and New Zealand, you have the indigenous peoples defeated and pushed out, moved into areas that are very almost uninhabitable and very undesirable to live at. In Australia, you will have the Aborigines, and in New Zealand, you'll have the Maori. And both of these people will be subject to the cruelty of the British Empire. Australia itself will be set up as mainly penal colonies. They're not all penal colonies, but you will have great parts of um, Australia set up as these basically uh, prisons. Though most of the settlers that actually go through into Australia are free and are there by their own choice. The British government in setting up Australia's colonies, they're going to learn a lot from the mistakes that they made in North America. They're going to make sure to give a lot of self rule to Australians, especially since they're so remote. And, you know, because of their remoteness, they get a lot more freedom, but they're also very dependent on the British because of how far away they are from everyone else and how little is set up to create um, their own manufactured goods. So they will clearly be dependent upon uh, the British government, and the British government themselves will make sure that the Australians are not going to want to rebel. So they give them a lot more freedom, and this leads to a lot of relative peace on the continent, at least when it comes to the colonists with the mother country. So unlike in the Americas, where there was a lot more control by the British, and because the Americans were a lot more self-reliant, they quickly rebelled. Instead, the Australians have the opposite, where they're very beholden to the British government, but at the same time they have a lot more autonomy. Because of this, you have relative peace on the continent, unless you're, of course, Aborigine or Maori in New Zealand. So peace prevails even among the criminals that litter Australia's shores, and Australia becomes a valuable part of the British government. But by 1900, the sun will not set on the British Empire. There will be a part of the world that is controlled by the British throughout the entire day. And so the British will be the most powerful of these imperial forces. Um, However, this imperial system is about to hit a major stumbling point. You're going to start seeing the rise of new powers, and in a couple of weeks, you'll see how this imperial system just cannot sustain itself and leads to the biggest conflict the world has seen up to this day.